And I thank the gentleman for yielding, and as was so eloquently put forward by Mr. Rehberg, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and Human Services Appropriations just a moment ago, this is a temporary limiting amendment on the appropriations for implementation of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. Bait and switch. That term was used by the other side just a moment ago in their arguments. Bait and switch. Think back to where we were just a little over a year ago in this House of Representatives when the Democrats' version of a health care bill passed. Where is that bill today? Somewhere in the dustbin out in the halls outside the office that the former speaker now occupies. Bait and switch. What happened on Christmas Eve of last year, of 2009? The Senate passed a bill that was never intended to become law. It was a placeholder. It was a vehicle to simply get the senators home for Christmas Eve ahead of a snowstorm so that then everyone could come back to the Capitol in January of 2010 and work on the bill that would ultimately become President Obama's health care reform. But it didn't happen. The Democrats lost an election in Massachusetts for the Senate seat. And that changed the paradigm, that changed the narrative, that changed the debate. And then, what happened? The House took up the bill passed by the Senate, conveniently a bill that had been passed by the House of Representatives the summer before as a housing bill, H.R. 3590. Look it up on Thomas at home if you doubt. 3590 passed the Senate. Why would Senator Reid, why would the other body take up a previously passed House bill and turn it into a health care bill? Because it wasn't a health care bill. It was a tax bill. It was a tax bill that had, by constitutional authority, had to originate in the House of Representatives. So then the other body had the perfect vehicle. Take this housing bill, strip out the housing language, put in the health care language, pass it on Christmas Eve, and then we'll all gather back after the New Year's Eve festivities and create a conference committee and pass the president's signature health care legislation. But it didn't happen that way. And then the elimination of opponents on the Democratic side began in sequential form, such that by March 23rd of last year, enough Democrats had changed their votes and would support the Senate-passed House bill. And the question, will the House now agree to the Senate amendment on 3590? But it's answered affirmatively. But was that the end of the story? No. This was extensively litigated in the political arena last fall. And what was the judgment of the American people after the litigation in the political arena? The answer was, we don't want it. We don't want any part of it. Fix it. Do something. So Chairman Rehberg is doing exactly that today within the limits that he is constrained by in a continuing resolution. He is providing the vehicle, the floor, by which the implementation of this very flawed process, this very flawed piece of this very flawed law can now be contained. It was important before, but 3 weeks ago it became critical. It became critical because of Judge Vinson's ruling. And why is that? And I encourage my colleagues to go to Judge Vinson's ruling. It's available on the internet. It's not hard to read. It's about 75 pages. Judge Vinson's ruling, page 76 of 78, because the individual mandate is unconstitutional and not severable, the entire act must be declared void. Pretty clear language. Now, why is it necessary to approach the funding? Because earlier in his opinion, Judge Vinson observed that there is a long-standing presumption that officials of the executive branch will adhere to the law as declared by the court. As a result, declaratory judgment is the functional equivalent of an injunction. Well, that should be good enough for members of the executive branch, the heads of federal agencies, but apparently that is not so. Because what we see today in our committee hearings, in the headlines in the newspapers, is that this administration is proceeding at light speed with implementation. The previous health care czar is now the deputy chief of staff in the White House. What does that tell you about their plans for implementation? In fact, the plans for implementation were going so fast that one of the chief architects of implementation was hired a month and a half before the bill was signed into law. And that's testimony that we heard in our committee in Energy and Commerce this past week. I sent a letter to Secretary Sebelius this week asking her to provide for us what direction she was going to take in light of Judge Vinson's ruling. I'll submit that as for the record, but I thank the gentleman for bringing this limiting amendment to the floor today. It is critically important that this Congress act to limit the implementation of this very flawed health care law. Let's get back to the work the American people asked us to do in the election, and I'll yield back to the gentleman.